She never thought you would leave. She thought your silence meant patience. She thought your loyalty meant permanence. She believed that no matter how distant she became, no matter how little effort she gave, you would remain exactly where she left you, waiting, understanding, available. But she misunderstood something important. Your silence was never weakness. It was exhaustion. It was disappointment buried beneath restraint. And eventually, it became detachment. Because there comes a moment in a man's life when he realizes something painful. He was not being loved. He was being taken for granted. And perhaps you know that feeling. The feeling of giving more than you received, of showing up consistently while being treated like an option, of staying loyal while wondering why your loyalty felt invisible. You told yourself to be patient. You told yourself love required sacrifice. You ignored your own discomfort because you believed that if you gave enough, cared enough, endured enough, eventually she would see your worth. But sometimes that moment never comes. Not because your worth was missing, but because what is always available is often the first thing people stop valuing. And that is the truth many men learn too late. They mistake self-sacrifice for love. They confuse emotional endurance with strength. They believe that being needed means being valued. Yet the Stoics warned us about this long ago. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one." And part of being a good man is understanding that goodness does not mean abandoning yourself to keep someone else comfortable. Because love without respect becomes suffering, and loyalty without reciprocity becomes silent grief. This video is not about bitterness. It is not about revenge, and it is not about proving someone wrong. It is about something deeper. It is about what happens when a man's worth is ignored, and the silence that follows forces everyone to confront what was lost. Because sometimes she does regret it.
Sometimes she remembers the loyalty she dismissed, the peace she disrupted, the man who stood beside her while she searched for value everywhere except in the place it already existed. But by then, everything has changed. So if you have ever felt overlooked, if you have ever stayed too long hoping to be appreciated, or if you have ever watched your own worth become invisible inside a relationship, then stay with me. Because tonight, we are going to talk about why she ignored your worth, why your silence shook her more than your words ever did, and why the moment a man remembers his value, nothing remains the same. But to understand the regret that came later, we have to begin with the illusion that made it possible in the first place. Because women rarely regret what they believe will never leave. And that was her mistake. She believed your loyalty was permanent. She believed your patience had no limit. She believed your presence was guaranteed. And once someone believes they cannot lose you, they often stop seeing your value at all.
Chapter 1. She never thought you would leave. She never thought you would leave, not because you were weak, but because you cared too deeply. She became familiar with your presence, your messages, your patience, your willingness to stay even when things no longer felt the same. At first, your loyalty mattered. Your effort was noticed. Your attention carried meaning. Your consistency felt comforting. But familiarity can quietly distort value. And this is where many men begin suffering without realizing it. Not when love disappears, but when appreciation does.
because what is consistently available is often slowly mistaken for something permanent, and permanence creates dangerous assumptions. She grew accustomed to you, to your understanding, to your emotional availability, to the idea that no matter how distant things became, you would still remain. The Stoic philosopher Seneca once wrote, "He who is brave is free." Most people misunderstand this. They think bravery only means confrontation, but sometimes bravery means something quieter. The courage to recognize when your presence has become expected instead of appreciated. And perhaps you felt that shift, the delayed replies, the colder energy, the strange imbalance where your effort remained steady while hers slowly faded. Nothing dramatic, just enough distance to make you wonder. And still, you stayed, not because you lacked dignity, but because you believed patience would heal what distance had damaged. You believed understanding would restore closeness. You believed love, if offered sincerely enough, would eventually be returned with equal care. But something else happened. The more dependable you became, the less valuable your presence appeared. Because people do not always neglect what lacks worth. Sometimes they neglect what feels impossible to lose. And she made that mistake. She mistook your loyalty for permanence, your patience for endless tolerance, your love for certainty. She did not fear losing your worth because she never imagined losing access to it. That was the illusion. And illusions often survive for a long time until reality interrupts them. Because while she grew more comfortable with your presence, you were quietly carrying the emotional weight of proving it. Giving more, explaining more, waiting longer, hoping she would finally recognize what had been standing beside her all along. But she didn't. Or perhaps she stopped trying to. And that is where appreciation quietly turns into entitlement.
Chapter 2. She took your worth for granted. She did not ignore your worth overnight. That is rarely how these things happen. Disrespect is often subtle in the beginning, quiet, gradual, almost easy to excuse. While you were investing more of yourself into the relationship, she was becoming increasingly comfortable with receiving what she no longer felt responsible for protecting. And that comfort changed the balance between you. Your loyalty became expected, your patience became routine, your effort became background noise. You showed up consistently, you checked in, you listened, you made space for her emotions, you stayed available even when your own needs were left unanswered. And at first, perhaps you told yourself this was simply love. After all, love requires effort, love requires sacrifice, love asks us to be patient. But there is a difference between sacrifice and self-erasure, and many men do not see that difference until they are already exhausted. Because what did your worth actually look like? It was not perfection, it was presence. You offered reliability in a world full of uncertainty. You offered honesty in a culture that rewards performance. You offered commitment while others offered temporary attention. And yet, those qualities often become invisible when someone assumes they will always be there. The philosopher Epictetus said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." That wisdom matters here. Because the moment your peace becomes dependent on someone finally appreciating you, your emotional freedom begins to disappear. And perhaps you felt that happening, the imbalance. You noticed yourself waiting more, explaining more, accepting behavior that quietly disturbed your peace just to avoid conflict. Meanwhile, her investment slowly changed, not always through open cruelty, sometimes through indifference, distance, minimal effort, attention directed elsewhere while your loyalty remained steady. You made plans, she made excuses. You tried to build connection, she became increasingly casual with what once mattered. And still, you defended her. You called it stress. You called it confusion. You told yourself she would come around, because that is what hope does. Hope can become dangerous when it asks you to ignore reality, and reality was becoming difficult to avoid. Your effort no longer inspired appreciation. It inspired expectation. This is the uncomfortable truth many men resist. When kindness is repeatedly given without boundaries, it can stop being seen as generosity and start being treated as obligation. Not because kindness is weak, but because unprotected value is often underestimated. And perhaps that was the painful shift you began noticing. You were no longer being cherished, you were being assumed. Your emotional labor felt automatic to her. Your loyalty felt guaranteed. And once someone believes they already own your devotion, they often stop treating it like something precious. That is how appreciation quietly turns into entitlement, not through hatred, but through unchecked access. And the tragic part is, while she was growing increasingly accustomed to your worth, you were working harder to prove it, trying more, giving more, hoping more, believing that if you loved deeply enough, she would finally recognize what she had. But when a man begins overextending himself to earn recognition, the wound grows deeper. Because now he is no longer simply loving, he is seeking validation. And that is where suffering begins to take root. Because the more you gave, the less certain you became that she truly saw you at all. Chapter 3. You kept giving, hoping she would notice. This is where many men lose themselves. Not in a single moment, but slowly, through effort that is never fully returned. You noticed the distance, you felt the imbalance, yet instead of stepping back, you leaned in harder. You gave more of your attention, more of your patience, more of your emotional energy. Because somewhere inside you, a quiet belief had taken hold. If I love better, maybe things will change. So you tried. You tried to become easier to understand, more patient, more forgiving. You overlooked what disturbed you just to preserve peace. When her energy felt colder, you became warmer. When communication weakened, you reached further. When effort became uneven, you carried more of the weight yourself. And perhaps you told yourself this was loyalty, that this was what commitment looked like. But beneath that loyalty, something painful was beginning to grow. Uncertainty. Because no matter how much you gave, something still felt missing. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." Think carefully about that, because when a man spends too long questioning his own value, his inner world begins to change. And perhaps yours did too. You started wondering, maybe I am expecting too much. Maybe I need to be more understanding. Maybe if I try harder, she will finally see how much I care. That is the trap. Not love, but conditional self-worth. The belief that appreciation can be earned through over-sacrifice. So you kept showing up. You defended her behavior to yourself. You minimized your discomfort. You ignored instincts that quietly warned you something was wrong. Not because you were foolish, but because hope can be louder than truth when the heart is involved. And hope kept whispering, "Stay longer. Be better. Don't give up yet." Meanwhile, the emotional cost kept rising. You stopped speaking as freely. You became more careful with your words, more hesitant, more aware of her moods than your own peace. You monitored yourself, adjusted yourself,
edited parts of your personality just to avoid tension. And that is where the wound deepens. Because when a man begins abandoning himself in order to maintain connection, he is no longer simply loving, he is negotiating for acceptance. And no relationship can remain healthy when one person keeps shrinking to keep it alive. Still, you stayed, not because you enjoyed suffering, but because you believed she would eventually understand your value. That one day she would look at your loyalty, your consistency, your effort, and finally recognize what had been standing beside her all along. But perhaps the hardest truth is this. She may have seen your worth. She simply stopped treating it like something she could lose. And when appreciation disappears, effort turns into exhaustion. Because no man can endlessly pour from a soul that feels unseen. Eventually, something inside begins to change. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. The hope weakens, the explanations become heavier, and the need to keep proving yourself slowly dies. Because there comes a moment when exhaustion speaks louder than attachment. And when that moment arrives, everything begins to shift.
Chapter 4. The moment you stopped chasing. There comes a moment when a man grows tired. Not tired of love, not tired of caring, but tired of carrying what was never meant to rest entirely on his shoulders. And perhaps that moment did not arrive all at once. Perhaps it came quietly, through repeated disappointment, through conversations that solved nothing, through the strange loneliness of standing beside someone while feeling emotionally alone. Because exhaustion has a way of revealing truths that hope keeps hidden. You began to notice something. No matter how carefully you explained yourself, the imbalance remained. No matter how much patience you offered, the distance stayed. And slowly, a realization emerged. Love should not require you to abandon your dignity. That realization changes a man, not into someone colder, but into someone clearer. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus wrote, "If someone is not treating you as you deserve, remember that it is not their actions that disturb you, but your judgment about what you must tolerate." Many men spend years trying to change another person's behavior. But Stoicism asks a different question. Why are you still negotiating with what repeatedly disturbs your peace? And perhaps that question finally reached you. Maybe it happened while staring at your phone, waiting for effort that never came. Maybe it happened after one disappointment too many. Or perhaps it happened in silence, when you looked at your own reflection and realized something painful. You no longer recognized the man trying so desperately to hold everything together. Because somewhere along the way,
You had become more focused on keeping her than keeping yourself. And that realization hurt. Not because she changed, but because you realized how much of yourself had been disappearing while trying to preserve the connection.
So something shifted. Quietly. You stopped explaining as much, stopped chasing conversations that felt forced, stopped overextending your energy to earn emotional reciprocity. Not from anger, not from revenge, but from clarity. You began protecting your peace. And that confused her, because she had grown accustomed to your pursuit, accustomed to your reassurance, accustomed to your emotional availability. Your effort had become part of the landscape. Predictable,
reliable, always there. But now, something felt different. You were still respectful, still composed, but no longer desperate to close every distance she created. And that change unsettled the dynamic between you, because people often notice value most clearly when access begins disappearing. This is where many women become uncomfortable, not because they suddenly hate the man they once overlooked, but because certainty is fading. The emotional security they quietly assumed would always remain no longer feels guaranteed. And that uncertainty creates a feeling they never expected to experience: loss. Because the man who once chased has grown silent. And silence carries a weight words rarely can. She expected frustration, arguments, emotional reactions. But what she did not expect was your withdrawal. And that is when your silence began saying what explanations never could. Because absence reveals value in ways presence sometimes cannot. And for the first time, she began to feel what you had been carrying all along: the discomfort, the uncertainty, the distance. Because when a man stops chasing, the emotional balance begins to change. And that is precisely what she never prepared for.
Chapter 5. Your silence shook her. She expected you to react. Most people do. They expect emotion, resistance, one final attempt to repair what has already been breaking for too long. But you did something she never fully prepared for. You became quiet. Not the silence of resentment, not the silence meant to punish, but the silence that comes when a man finally grows weary of explaining pain to someone who no longer listens. And that silence unsettled her more than words ever could. Because chaos survives through participation. The moment you stopped feeding it, the dynamic changed. The Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote, "Nothing is more honorable than a grateful heart." And perhaps this is why silence became so powerful, because gratitude had disappeared long before your voice did. What she once received freely, your reassurance, your patience, your emotional presence, had slowly become ordinary to her, expected. And now, for the first time, she was confronting their absence. At first, perhaps she did not understand it. She assumed you were upset, needing space, cooling off, because people who grow accustomed to loyalty often believe it will return on command. But this silence felt different. It was calm, measured, final in a way she could not easily explain. You were no longer arguing to be understood, no longer defending your intentions, no longer chasing emotional clarity from someone unwilling to meet you halfway. And that changed everything. Because silence creates reflection, especially when access was once taken for granted. Suddenly, the certainty she had relied on began disappearing. Your messages were gone. Your emotional availability had withdrawn. The familiar comfort of knowing you would always be there no longer felt secure. And uncertainty has a strange effect on people. It forces them to notice what routine once concealed. She began remembering, not dramatically at first, just small things. Your consistency, the way you checked in, the patience she once overlooked, the emotional steadiness she had quietly grown dependent upon, because what is constant often becomes invisible until it is gone. And this is the irony many never see coming. While you once feared losing her,
She now faced the unfamiliar feeling of losing access to you. Not ownership, not control, access. And there is a difference, because genuine value is rarely understood while it feels endlessly available. It becomes visible when absence interrupts consumption. That is why your silence carried such weight. It forced reality into the room. No argument, no blame, just absence where certainty once lived. And perhaps for the first time, she began questioning something she had never questioned before. What if he doesn't come back? That question changes everything, because regret does not always arrive through dramatic heartbreak. Sometimes it enters quietly, through realization. The realization that someone patient, someone loyal, someone deeply invested was never as replaceable as we imagined. And this is where memory begins its work, because once silence creates reflection, people start revisiting what they once overlooked. And that is exactly where her mind began to go. Back to your value, back to your presence, back to everything she assumed would always remain.
Chapter 6. Now she remembers your worth. Silence has a way of awakening memory. Not immediately, but gradually. At first there was confusion, then curiosity, and eventually reflection. Because once your presence was no longer available to reassure her, she was left alone with something she had spent a long time avoiding: perspective. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Loss is nothing else but change, and change is nature's delight." Most people resist this truth. They do not notice value while it quietly supports their lives. They notice it when change removes easy access to it. And perhaps that is where she found herself now. Remembering. Not the fantasy, not the excitement, but the substance she once overlooked. She remembered your consistency, the messages you sent without being asked, the way you listened when her world felt heavy, the calm you brought into moments others might have abandoned. Because your worth was never built on perfection. It was built on presence. And presence carries weight, especially after it disappears. She remembered the emotional safety you created, the reassurance, the reliability, the certainty that you genuinely cared. Things that once felt ordinary now carried a different meaning. Because attention from strangers may flatter the ego, but it rarely comforts the soul. And this is where regret often begins. Not necessarily because someone loses control, but because they lose something real. Perhaps she revisited old conversations, old photos, moments she once brushed aside, not because memory lies, but because distance clarifies. And clarity can be uncomfortable, because now she could see the contrast: temporary attention, surface-level validation, conversations without depth. And against that comparison, your value became harder to ignore. This is the painful irony. While you were present, she focused on what felt exciting. But once you stepped away, stability became visible. Loyalty became rare, and the man she once treated as permanent began to feel irreplaceable. Seneca wrote, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more that is poor." There is wisdom in that, because sometimes people lose good things not from malice, but from endless dissatisfaction. The belief that something better always exists just beyond what they already have. And perhaps she confronted that realization now, because no matter how many distractions appeared, they did not feel the same. No one carried your history, your emotional investment, your steady presence. And slowly, the truth became difficult to avoid. You were not asking for too much. You were asking for reciprocity. And that realization carries its own ache, not because you were flawless, but because genuine value is difficult to replace once it is gone. So yes, perhaps she remembers now. Perhaps she understands what she overlooked. Perhaps she regrets dismissing the loyalty she once assumed would always remain. But this is where many men misunderstand the story, because her regret is not the destination. And if you are not careful, you can mistake being remembered for being healed. That is why the next lesson matters most, because the purpose of your silence was never to create guilt. It was to reclaim yourself.
Chapter 7. But her regret is not your destination. This is where many men become trapped, not by heartbreak, but by hope returning through a different disguise. Because once regret appears, the temptation follows. The message, the curiosity, the quiet question lingering beneath the surface. Does she finally understand my worth now? And perhaps she does. Perhaps she misses your presence. Perhaps she replays memories. Perhaps she now sees the loyalty she once overlooked. But Stoicism asks us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Someone else's realization cannot become the foundation of your healing. The philosopher Epictetus wrote, "No person is free who is not master of himself." Read that again, because freedom is not simply leaving. Freedom is no longer needing validation from the place that wounded you. And that distinction matters, because your silence was never supposed to become a strategy, not bait, not emotional leverage, not a performance designed to pull regret from another person. Its purpose was something far more important: peace. The peace you lost while constantly proving your value. The peace that disappeared while you kept overextending yourself for recognition. The peace that slowly returns the moment you stop negotiating your worth. And perhaps this is where your transformation truly began. Not when she started remembering, but when you stopped needing to be remembered. Because healing changes a man. Quietly. You start rebuilding, not for revenge, not for applause, but because neglected parts of yourself deserve restoration. You reclaim your mornings, your discipline, your routines. You invest in your body, your mind, your purpose. And slowly, something remarkable happens. The energy once spent chasing clarity becomes energy invested in growth. The late-night overthinking weakens. The emotional dependency loosens. And for the first time in a long while, your life stops revolving around whether someone else finally understands your value. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That is the heart of this chapter. Because her regret belongs to her, her realization belongs to her, but your peace belongs to you. And peace is too expensive to trade for uncertainty again. This does not mean bitterness. It does not mean hatred. Stoicism never teaches resentment. It teaches clarity. And clarity asks difficult questions. If someone only values your presence after losing access to it, what exactly are you returning to? The same imbalance? The same emotional confusion? The same version of yourself that survived on hope while starving for reciprocity? These are not questions of ego. They are questions of self-respect. Because sometimes regret arrives late. Sometimes apologies arrive after damage has already changed the landscape. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself
is continue walking, not to punish anyone, but to honor the lesson. Because your healing was never meant to depend on whether she finally understood. It was meant to teach you something deeper, that your worth should never require disappearance to be recognized. And once a man truly understands that, he no longer chases validation. He protects peace. He protects dignity. He protects the self he nearly abandoned trying to be loved. And that brings us to the final truth, not about her, but about you, and about the value you should never have doubted in the first place.
Conclusion. Know your worth before it is lost. Perhaps this is the hardest lesson of all. Not that she ignored your worth, not even that she regretted it later, but that somewhere along the way, you began forgetting it too. And that is not a judgment. It is a human truth. Because when love becomes imbalanced, people often start measuring themselves through someone else's response, their attention, their affection, their approval. And slowly, without noticing, self-worth becomes outsourced. But Stoicism has always warned against this. The philosopher Seneca wrote, "Begin at once to live, and count each separate day as a separate life." There is wisdom there, because too many men postpone their peace, waiting for recognition, waiting for appreciation, waiting for someone else to finally confirm the value that should never have required confirmation. But life moves forward, and so must you. Not angrily, not bitterly, but consciously. Because your worth was never meant to depend on whether someone stayed or whether someone regretted leaving. Real worth is quieter than that. It lives in character, in discipline, in integrity, in the ability to remain kind without becoming self-sacrificing, to remain loving without abandoning boundaries, to remain open-hearted without surrendering dignity. And perhaps that is the lesson this experience leaves behind. You were not asking for perfection. You were asking for reciprocity, for mutual effort, mutual care, mutual respect. And those are not unreasonable desires. They are foundations. Because love was never supposed to feel like constant proving. It was never supposed to require shrinking yourself to preserve connection. And if losing access to you taught her something, let that lesson belong to her. Your responsibility now lies elsewhere, with the man you are becoming. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Dwell on the beauty of life, watch the stars, and see yourself running with them." What a powerful reminder, because life is larger than disappointment, larger than rejection, larger than the memory of being overlooked. And perhaps that is where your strength truly lives, not in making someone regret losing you, but in refusing to lose yourself again. So continue, build quietly, heal honestly, protect your peace with the same loyalty you once gave so freely to others. And remember this. A man's worth is not measured by how desperately he is pursued, but by how deeply he honors himself. She may remember your value now. She may regret what she dismissed. She may finally understand what your presence meant. But that understanding arrived after a lesson silence had to teach. And by then, you had already learned your own. Your worth was never lost, only forgotten. And once remembered, peace becomes non-negotiable. But perhaps this leaves us with an uncomfortable question. Did she truly regret losing you, or did she simply regret losing access to what you gave? That is a difficult distinction. Because sometimes people do miss you, and sometimes they miss the comfort, certainty, and emotional safety they assumed would always remain. Stoicism invites us to reflect honestly, not emotionally. Thank you for watching Stoic Wisdom today. So I want to ask you, can someone truly value your worth only after losing it, or is regret sometimes nothing more than attachment to lost access? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this message spoke to something you have lived through, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and continue this journey towards self-respect, clarity, and inner strength. Because wisdom is not merely learned, it is lived. Until next time, stay calm, stay grounded, stay stoic.